Hi guys, welcome back to 30 Days to Your First Website Design, a Touch Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to simply go a little further into the CSS of our web design. We'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. Well, we're going to open up our layout PSD, our HTML and our CSS so far, and concentrate on the column layout. We'll then examine the ClearFix hack to solve our floating problems. Then once we've completed that, I'll suggest some further reading and then set an assignment. Okay, this is a nice theory-free video, so let's dive straight into our PSD and remind ourselves of the progress so far. And here it is. The completed PSD looks like this. As you remember, our markup was complete and we'd finished styling this upper area. We're now in the process of building these columns here, the 3 columns for our team and these 2 columns for our contact area. And if we look at how it's currently faring in the browser, we can see that some of the styling is still missing. We have the content, but we need to just style it correctly. So let's jump into our CSS and our HTML and figure out what needs doing next. Well, we have our columns here. These are our articles, if you remember. Each one has a class of subcol and is further identified by a secondary class to allow us to give us a little bit more control. Then we have our larger columns, each one having a class of col and a secondary class there. So let's go to the bottom of our CSS file and we'll add a section which we'll call columns, for obvious reasons. We'll begin with our larger columns, and I'll put down here our sub columns. Now each one is going to need a width, so we'll go back into our PSD, we'll bring up our guides and our grid and remind ourselves of the dimensions. Now you'll recall that we used the 960 grid framework, and we could in fact use the CSS that's provided with that framework had we not have used the grid in a sort of arbitrary way. As you can see, our columns actually consist of gutters on the outside and then the columns within them, and then we've actually used a column as our guttering, which is fine. We can do exactly whatever we please. The grid is there for our use, but it means that we're going to have to define the grid dimensions ourselves. So we can see here we've got guttering of 40 pixels for these smaller columns with widths of 260. So let's just define that here. Those are widths of 260, and they had guttering which we'll define with a margin of 40 pixels on the right hand side. Now these are going to float left, which means they're all going to tuck in beside each other on the screen. Now we've got very similar styling for our column, but we have different dimensions, of course, which I happen to know are 380 pixels of width with a margin of 50 on the right. So I'll save that, and I'm going to refresh our page in the browser. Now instantly what you can see are a couple of problems, apart from it looking horrendous. Firstly, you'll notice that our third column here, and that's the case with these larger columns as well, the last column in the collection is too wide to fit within the wrapping element, and that's because we've given them all this margin, whereas the third one in this case doesn't have space for that, so it's been squashed underneath them. So we're going to use our additional classes. In this case that was col3 for our last column, just to remove the margin. In the case of our larger column, the second column, I want to apply the margin actually to the left hand side instead of the right. So I'll just check that. And you can see now that they regardless of the messing up of the clearing here, which we'll discuss in a second, you can see that they're positioned correctly. We have the 3 columns, and then nicely underneath we have 2 columns, the correct widths, and in the correct positions. So what we need to be doing is clearing these floats, because the containing element, in this case with the 3 columns, it was this upper light area here. The containing element isn't able to actually contain them because they're breaching its boundaries. We need to add a 3rd element underneath them, sorry, a 4th element in this case, which will then clear the floats and force the containing element to once again wrap things up. And I can demonstrate this by adding some markup here. If I add a div to the just after all the articles here, and I'm going to give it some inline styling here. I'm going to clear both on that. This is a common approach. You can see that if I just inspect the elements here using my element inspector, I'll find this div, and here it is, and you can see it there. It's filled the width of the page, the wrapper rather, and it's cleared those floats, forcing the containing element to once again hold everything within it. That's great, but it kind of goes against everything which we've said about separating our concerns. We've basically used a presentational, we've used a structural item for presentational purposes. This shouldn't really be in here. It doesn't have any semantic value whatsoever. So we'll get rid of it. What we're instead going to do is use the clearfix hack by generating an element using our CSS. Now we'll do that at the bottom here. This is quite a well documented and commonly used hack. Firstly, what I'm going to need to do is assign a class to all the elements, the containing elements, which I need to behave as containers. These are containers which contain floating elements which need clearing. So we're going to call that group, which I believe Jeffrey Zellman coined as a very semantic way of describing a grouped area of floats. So we'll use that class there. Now we're going to use a pseudo selector of after. And if you recall, earlier on we used the pseudo element before in order to add this element to our testimonials here. Now all we're doing is adding a clearing element after these group containers. We do so in a similar way. We assign it some content, in this case nothing, but at least it brings it into the land of the living, and we're going to give it a display of block. So it's a block level element, and we're clearing both just as we did with our div. Now in order to make it visible, I'm going to give it a height of 5 pixels and a background of black. So that will just illustrate to you what I've done, and you can see it there and there, serving its purpose perfectly, and the markup hasn't been touched at all, of course, so that's great. So if I get rid of the background color and the height, that will be entirely invisible. Now there are a couple of additional lines which you'll need in order to cater for some older browsers, naming no names. I'm going to suggest some further reading at the end of this video, and you can then go and read more about exactly what this does. But needless to say, this is a very solid way of clearing your uncontrollable floats. So that's looking pretty good. Now, whilst we're here, I'm just going to improve these headers here, just so we can slap ourselves on the back and continue with what we're doing. I happen to know that the H3s are very similar to the H2s that we defined earlier on in the series. They have a font size of 28, and we're going to give them a line height of 40, which will keep them adhered to the baseline grid. I'm also going to add a margin at the bottom of 20 pixels, which once again keeps things along the baseline grid. So if I refresh the page, you can see those looking an awful lot better. One little problem I can see here is there's a random line which is cropped up I'm not entirely sure what that is, so I'm going to just inspect that here. I can see it's got something to do with form, which according to my CSS here has an additional background, even though its containing element has a background, and that's because I can see I've assigned it a class of contact when the section that it's in is also a class of contact, and that's where this additional background's coming from. And this border at the top, it's that border at the top we can see. Yeah. So I need to just go and remove that class from the form. Here's our form. I'll just change that to contact form. And then we refresh the page. That's excellent. Now there are two more columns which need floating. Those are our address columns. I'm going to begin by changing this address because it's too big. Excuse me while I do this. There we go. That will just deal with that. That should be 3 lines now instead of 4. These are our addresses. Now I'm just going to grab these from the CSS I prepared earlier just to speed things up. There are columns once again, so I'm going to add this little piece to the bottom of our columns section. Much the same idea, they have a width, a margin, and they float to the left. And of course we've already applied our clear fix to the containing element here, so that shouldn't be a problem anymore. And there they are, perfectly neat. Okay, there's still some styling to be done. For example, the border around this image, I can do with adding some more spacing to the images here. But the purposes of this video are complete. We wanted to sort our columns out and discuss exactly what ClearFix, the ClearFix hack, does for us. So it's time now for some further reading. I'm going to jump back into our presentation here. I'd like to take a look at what Chris Coyer over on CSS Tricks has to say about the ClearFix hack. He also suggests that you head over to Nicholas Gallagher's blog for a look at his newer approach to clear fixing. Now before we jump into the next video, I'd like you to bring your HTML and CSS up to where we are now. Next time on 30 days to your first website design, we're going to continue our project and also look into browsers. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us here at TutsPlus, thanks for watching.